All right. Sorry for the change of scenery today. Because of the change in my schedule, I'm going to have to just record these videos by myself rather than having the students with me as well. Today, class is going to cover Chapter 16 of VRUB, which has to do with deficits and debt. So here we're going to be talking about the federal budget deficit and the federal debt. Sorry, there's a little bit of a glare right there. In addition to that, we're going to be talking about some issues dealing with deficit spending, tax cuts, tax increases, etc. And so we're going to start off with a topic that is very pertinent to the current debate between the candidates, and it has to do with this concept of supply-side economics. Now, this primarily has to do with stuff out of Chapter 15, so we're going to use that aggregate demand, aggregate supply model once again to talk about the effect of tax cuts in a world in which these things don't just affect aggregate demand but also affect aggregate supply, and talk a little bit about an evaluation of those sorts of policies. The next thing that we'll talk a little bit about is the deficit. What does it mean? How is it defined? And how do we need to think about it in terms of what are the negative effects of deficits? And then finally, we'll talk about the debt. Now, this is the second to the last chapter in the textbook. We're going to cover these topics dealing with federal budgets before we move on to the final chapter, which is looking forward and talking about the degree to which the future of the U.S. and world economy is really going to be driven by countries in Asia, specifically China. So this is our topic now. It's finishing up this one section of macroeconomics, talking about specifically supply-side economics, dealing with tax policy, deficits, and debt, which are tied into those subjects as well. So, first thing that we're going to consider is what is supply-side economics? This is basically a set of tax and spending policies meant to change aggregate supply in order to stimulate the economy. So supply-side economics is a set of tax and spending policies meant to change aggregate supply in order to stimulate the economy. This is different from the Keynesian approach, which is the policies that we've been talking about before in terms of expansionary fiscal policy, because expansionary fiscal policy, the way we traditionally think about it, only affects aggregate demand. Here we're actually going to be talking about aggregate supply, so it's the other side of the other blade of the scissors, if you will. So how does this actually go about working? Well, let's go back to our aggregate demand, aggregate supply model a little bit to talk about this. If you remember from our depiction of that model, on the y-axis, we had the price level. So again, the price level being the index number that tells us what the overall level of price is in. And oftentimes we talk about that as being the consumer price index or the CPI. So the CPI, or the consumer price index, is our measure of the price level. And our measure of output in the aggregate, again, this is a macroeconomic model, so we're talking about all the aggregate demand, all of the aggregate supply. So our output is our real gross domestic product. Real GDP, or the real gross domestic product, which is the value of all goods and services in the economy when controlling for changes in prices. So this is our aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. And if you remember, in this model, we take an upward sloping aggregate supply curve, so AS, aggregate supply, that's our upward sloping aggregate supply curve. And we have a downward sloping aggregate demand curve, so AD, aggregate demand, downward sloping aggregate demand curve, upward sloping aggregate supply. Remember, the problem with this policies, or this story that we had is that if we did anything that stimulated aggregate demand, that would shift it to the right, and a shift to the right might increase real GDP, but it would also increase the price level, which means that we'd get inflation. So you're either going to increase GDP and increase inflation, or you're going to decrease aggregate demand, which would decrease GDP and decrease inflation. So you can either control inflation, excuse me, or you can increase GDP. You can't both stimulate the economy in terms of producing more stuff and keeping inflation under control. But what if there was a policy that actually could shift the aggregate supply curve to the right? What if there was something that could do that? Even if it also ends up increasing aggregate demand some as well. Look what we now have. We go from price level 1 to price level 2, which is barely below. You know, it's a little bit below, but that's about the same. And we go from Y1 for GDP to Y2 for GDP. So if we're able to stimulate both the aggregate supply curve and the aggregate demand curve at the same time, then we would be able to increase GDP, which will decrease unemployment. So increase GDP, decrease unemployment, and keep the price level about the same. Well, that'd be awesome if we could do that. What sort of policy might do that? Well, back in the 1980 presidential campaign, so it was, about this time of the year, a little bit earlier, more like February, March, you had a presidential candidate that claimed that he had a policy, so 1980 presidential campaign, so he said his policy that he had, that they would do the following things. 1, increase GDP. 2, decrease unemployment. 3, keep prices stable. And here's the real kicker. The last thing that they would do, that these policies, when all put together, would do, would be to reduce the federal deficit and debt. Increase GDP, decrease unemployment. Now, those two things can go together pretty well, right? We've shown any aggregate demand policy that will stimulate aggregate demand, for example, a tax cut or an increase in government spending, according to our macroeconomic model of aggregate demand, aggregate supply, anything that's an expansionary fiscal policy would do that. Likewise, expansionary monetary policy. But here, keep prices stable. Now you're talking about having to do something else because, again, generally, if you decrease unemployment, you increase the price level. And then finally, reducing the federal budget deficit. Well, another candidate in the Republican convention that year said, all this stuff, I don't buy it. I'm going to call this stuff voodoo economics because it's some sort of magic that's going to make all this stuff happen. Well, of course, in 1980, the presidential candidate who ended up proposing all these policies was none other than Ronald Reagan, and the person who called it voodoo economics was, of course, George H.W. Bush, who ended up becoming his vice presidential running mate. And he stopped talking about voodoo economics pretty soon after Reagan picked him to be his vice president. Now, why would Reagan say that all these things can happen? Well, let's talk about the following. So, according to supply-side economics, tax cuts do the following. They increase aggregate demand and they increase aggregate supply by even more. That's the first thing to keep in mind. So just like we showed on the graph a few minutes ago, A tax cut could increase aggregate demand because, of course, if there's more disposable income, people have more money in their pocket. That's something that we've talked about before. A decrease in taxes will increase aggregate demand. But what he was claiming is that there's also this other effect, which is that if people can keep more of their money, then they're more likely to use their resources. Remember, aggregate supply is determined by the number of resources used. So resources include labor and capital. If you decrease taxes on labor, more people are willing to work. That would increase aggregate supply. If you decrease taxes on capital, more people would be willing to use their capital towards productive enterprises. Therefore, that would increase aggregate supply as well. So not only does a cut in taxes have the stimulating effect of leading to higher disposable income and therefore more aggregate demand, but it also has this aggregate supply effect. Well, that stuff, most economists would believe that there might be some small aggregate supply stimulation that comes about because of a cut in taxes. But how about this fourth one? Remember, decrease the budget deficit. Well, you have to remember that tax revenue minus, I'll do it like this. Government spending minus tax revenue net of transfers. Remember, when we talk about transfers, we're talking about cash transfers, things like Social Security. So government spending minus our cash transfers. So this is all the money that we spend. These are our outlays. This is our revenue. If government spending is bigger than our tax revenue, then that is equal to our budget deficit. Well, we know that government spending could decrease, but this was going to happen even without government spending decreasing. So how was it that a decrease in tax rates leads to an increase in tax revenue? This is the claim claimed by supply-siders. And it all comes down to this concept known as the Laffer curve. So it's not like a Laffer as in, yeah, haha, it's a funny joke. It's named after Arthur Laffer, who supposedly derived this on a cocktail napkin in a bar in Washington, D.C. He was a well-known policy wonk sort of economist, and he was sitting there, and someone said, I don't understand about how, the relationship between tax rates and tax revenues. And, right now, if we cut taxes, all we're going to do is lose revenue. He said, no. You have to understand that because of the incentive effects, you have tax revenue on our y-axis. So we'll have tax revenue here. This is our tax revenue. You can have the tax rates on the x, where they go from 0% to 100%. All right. If your tax rate is 0, and your tax rate is 100%, either one of these, what's going to end up happening is that you're not going to get any tax revenue. Because if you don't tax at all, there could be lots of things that you could tax, but you're not going to get any revenue if you have a 0% tax rate. And likewise, at a 100% tax rate, no one would engage in any economic activity because they know they're going to lose all of it to the federal government anyway. So at both a 0% tax rate and a 100% tax rate, tax revenue will be equal to 0. As you're increasing away from 0, your tax revenue increases. And then as you're increasing away from 100%, your tax revenue has to increase. At some point, there's going to be a maximum amount of tax revenue that you're able to get out of the maximum tax rate. So we'll call that little t star. So there's some little t star that maximizes tax revenue. We'll call that capital TR star. So there is some tax rate that maximizes tax revenue. And what Laffer was claiming was that essentially we were on the right-hand side of T star, that we were somewhere over in here such that if we cut back in tax rates, we would increase tax revenue. And that means as we cut taxes, we could decrease the budget deficit because we increase tax revenue, and the deficit is the difference between our government spending and our tax revenue. This gets bigger when we cut taxes, therefore you cut the budget deficit. Now, the problem with the Laffer curve and the problem with supply-side economics is that theoretically all this stuff is possible. In reality, there's no way in hell we're to the right of T star here. We're clearly over to the left of T star. This might be possible if we're at 80 or 85% marginal tax rates, something like that. Our average tax rates are less than 30%. Therefore, it's very unlikely that a cut in the tax rate would increase tax revenue. And we've seen in Mississippi that we've been doing this. We've been cutting tax rates, and instead of increasing tax revenue, like the supply-siders in Jackson had believed would happen, we have lost tax revenue. And so it looks like, as it was announced this morning, that Southern Miss is going to start off with about $3 million less next year than we started off this last year, because there are lower and lower tax revenues going to the state because they've been cutting tax rates the last couple of years. And it's going to continue to happen. Lower tax rates lead to lower tax revenue, not higher tax revenue, the way that supply-siders claim. There's absolutely no empirical evidence to support that aspect of supply-side economics. Let's just talk a little bit more then about deficits and debt. Like I explained, government spending minus tax revenue, net of transfers, is equal to the budget deficit. Current budget deficit in the United States, estimated for fiscal year 2016, which ends in September, is expected to be $544 billion. This comes from an estimated total revenue equal to $3,376,000,000,000. So 3,000 billion is 3 trillion. And outlays, which is the fancy name for government spending, of $3,919,000,000,000. And then there's some adjustments on budget and off budget that will ultimately lead to the total amount of about $544 billion. Now, is that a large budget deficit or is that a small budget deficit? Well, it's approximately 3% of GDP. And that number is, in fact, about almost half of a percentage point higher than it was just in fiscal year 2015. Now, what are sorts of things that cause the budget deficit to grow or to shrink? The first thing is, let's think about government spending. If the government creates a bunch of new policies, things like spending more money on wars or potentially starting new projects. We talked about the stimulus last time. During the stimulus years, we were running budget deficits of almost $1 trillion. So large government spending is going to increase the budget deficit because government spending minus tax revenues, if outlays are really big, then that's going to cause a budget deficit. Likewise, tax revenues. If tax revenues are small, then that revenue side is going to be smaller. That would lead to a larger budget deficit. Now, specifically, what we saw was that in fiscal year 2015, the deficit was $439 billion. Fiscal year 2016, it was it's expected to be $544 billion. Now, what has happened between fiscal year 2015 and fiscal year 2016? One of the things that can happen is how does economic growth affect this? Well, the first thing that you have to think about is tax revenue. If the economy is growing more, people have more income, then we end up with more income to tax. That's going to increase tax revenue. Tax revenue between 2015 and 2016 increased by about $130 billion. So tax revenue So it's not as if tax revenue was getting smaller. Now, was it getting enough bigger such that what we expected given the level of growth? It was a little bit slow. But more importantly, we had outlays. So mandatory outlays increased by about 170 billion. So if that's the only thing that happened, then we'd only expect about 40 billion to increase. So what else increased? Well, we also saw some revision of the way that we count our taxes, and so between that and some of the technical changes, we end up increasing the federal budget deficit by about $100 billion from year to year. Now, it's a lot of money to increase, especially if it's largely has to do with technical stuff, but nonetheless, this is where we are. Now, what is the relationship between this and the debt? And what is the bad side of deficits and debt? So first, let me just define a debt, and then we can talk about the negative effects on the macroeconomy from debt. The way that I like to think about this is that deficits are a yearly flow. So think about like income. Okay? A debt is the accumulation of all the deficits. So that would be like wealth. So if you save some money every single year, if you have income and you're saving money, that's flowing into the house, and your income minus your expenditure is going to be your savings. And then if you save up over time, that's going to create a wealth. So if you save $20 a week for a month, then you end up with $80 in savings accumulated. Likewise, if you end up borrowing an extra $1,000 a month because you're a poor college student and you still want to spend a lot of money, then you end up with $1,000 of deficit every single year, and over a year, then you end up with $12,000 worth of debt in addition to whatever interest rate they're charging. Now, that's the definition. How does this negatively affect the economy? So, a couple things. So, let's think about the negative effects of a debt. The first thing to think about is that it has a negative effect on investment because it crowds out savings private savings and investment. So the negative effects of a debt include the negative effect on investment. And again, what do we mean by investment in this case? We mean businesses buying machinery or building factories or accumulating inventories in order to sell more in the future. So remember, investment is like business expenditure. If you have more of the higher budget deficit or more debt, it's going to crowd out the private savings. Why? Well, if the government has to borrow money, where is it going to borrow from? It borrows from individual savers. So, for example, if I'm thinking about, if I have an extra, let's say $3,000 at the end of this year, and I can put in some savings. Lots of different kinds of savings instruments. I could just put it in my bank. That's one thing I could do. I could put it into a corporate bond, like General Motors floats bonds. I can loan General Motors money and then they'll pay me a rate of return on that bond. I could put in the stock market, General Motors stock. I could buy, Eli Lilly stock. I could end up buying, Aramark stock. I could buy lots of different company stocks. I could buy those stocks. I could do those things. Or I could buy a government bond. A government bond gives me a very low rate of return that's guaranteed. It's much safer than GM. It's much safer than Aramark. It's much safer than any other business. So I could do that. Well, if I take my $3,000 and I give it to the government in the form of my cash and they give me a bond, if that's the trade-off, I get a bond, they get my cash, who's not getting my cash? Aramark's not getting my cash. GM isn't getting my cash. Wells Fargo isn't getting my savings into my account. What does Wells Fargo do with that money? Then they loan it out to a small business. None of the businesses end up with my savings because I've taken my private savings and I've invested in the government. Because how do they fund the debt? Well, they float bonds. They float instruments of savings or instruments that we can use as savings. So my private savings goes toward the federal debt rather than going towards local businesses. That's going to crowd out investment. Businesses have less cash to spend. Now, the other thing that it can do, less private savings going towards investment, leads to higher interest rates. So if you have less of the private savings going towards the investment, then that's going to lead towards higher interest rates. Specifically, what ends up happening is that there are all sorts of people that want your cash savings. And that's going to be General Motors, and it's going to be Aramark, and it's going to be Jimmy John's, and it's going to be Pizza Hut, and it's going to be all these people want your money to build up their business enterprises. If you add in the federal government, who also wants your money, then you have many more people demanding it. What happens when people, you add more demanders to a model? Well, into a market, well, the price ends up going up. What is the price of savings? Well, that's the interest rate. So that's going to jack up the interest rate. Now, who is that bad for? It's bad for anyone who is borrowing money. Who borrows money? People with mortgages borrow money. People with house notes borrow money. People with car notes borrow money. People with a credit card debt borrow money. All those people are going to be hurt if there's more government deficit that needs the private savings. Let's see. Another negative effect is that it leads to less flexibility with government spending. So, for example, the government may need to go to war. Historically, if we've already run a really large deficit, there may not be enough people willing to supply the federal government more money. And so if we are already running a large deficit, which is $540 billion a year, we already have a big debt, which is approximately 70% of GDP, that's our accumulated debt, then we end up with less flexibility in case we really do need to spend some money. And then the final thing is that it does risk a financial collapse. As we're going to talk about next time, a lot of people are worried that with foreign nationals, especially China, owning a lot of this debt, that they could come to call on it. If they call on it and we don't have enough money to pay, then that's going to devalue the U.S. currency. People are going to try to get rid of U.S. denominated assets, and that's going to lead ultimately to a financial collapse of the United States economy. That's what people are worried about more than anything else. This percentage of the debt to GDP ratio is much higher than it was before. By the end of the decade, it's expected to go from, it's about 67% right now, it's expected to go to 76% by the end of the decade. These are very large numbers historically. Haven't been that large since approximately World War II. All of this means that the deficit is something that people really worry about. Now, how about some issues with this? Well, because foreign nationals buy so much of this debt, we haven't really seen the interest rate increase. Interest rates are very, very low still, even though we have a relatively large debt. Flexibility with government spending, this is definitely an issue, but right now it looks like government spending isn't going to go anywhere, and the risk of financial collapse, as we're going to talk a little bit more about next time. If China decides to start dumping our debt, this is U.S. denominated debt. In other words, we only have to pay them back with dollars. If dollars are worth less in the future, well, guess what? Then they're getting less money back. So even though the Chinese own about $2 trillion of our $15 trillion in debt, what ends up happening is that, well, it's only about $12 trillion that's being held outside of the Social Security system. So $2 trillion of this is held by the Chinese. If they end up hurting the value of that debt, then they end up hurting their own economy. So it's very unlikely that that's going to happen. But these are still the concerns, and this is the reason why we have had so much policy around this in the past 6 years, trying to get a hold of this issue of U.S. federal deficit, the federal deficits and the debt. All right, it's going to be a fairly short class today. I appreciate your patience with the new setup in the room. If you have any questions, I'm going to be posting this video. It should be up on Tuesday night. If you have any questions, definitely email me. All right, good luck studying for the final.